Okay. Well, good morning. My name is Stephen Rogers, and it is truly my pleasure to welcome our two very distinguished speakers who will be on the panel, as well as our audience. I am the executive director for the Africa Faith and Justice Network, which is a Catholic faith-based advocacy network based here in Washington, D.C. This on behalf of the Advocacy Network for Africa and all of our allies. I am excited to welcome you here today for this workshop titled "Reversing Financial Theft and Reshaping Mechanisms to Restore Well-Being: the role of the faith-based community." Around around the globe, the many weapons of war must be reshaped towards peace. In like fashion, powerful mechanisms of international financial exploitation must be transformed into tools for development. In Africa, where financial institutions based in many external countries, including the United States, extract value and resources from the continent, just as they've also facilitated the flood of weapons of war. In so doing, they introduce deprivation and escalates conflicts instead of promoting peace and equity. So this workshop actually focuses on the challenges of reversing these processes with attention to financial dimension. I just wanted to make one point that came up yesterday in a conversation during one of the plenary in which Marie Dennis of Pax Christi made a particular statement on theological dialogue. And she said this, which I think is very relevant for our conversation. She said, impoverishing a population is a particularly egregious sort of violence. It's an unjust economy, global economy, that exacerbates poverty and creates a huge gap between the few who are extremely wealthy and the majority who are very poor. It leads to violent conflict and war. In other words, economic justice in itself is a form of violence. So this is how this workshop is related to the overarching theme of the Ecumenical Advocacy Days lobbying. It is now my privilege to welcome two distinguished speakers. The first one that I will introduce is Dr. Pauline Kamau from Kenya. She represents the Quaker International. She's the Quaker International Affairs representative. Dr. Kamau holds a degree, a PhD in gender and development, an MA in diplomacy and international studies, a postgraduate diploma in gender and development, and a bachelor's degree in education in business and economics. She has more than 25 years of professional experience in programming, human rights, secure livelihood development, advocacy, fundraising, gender and development. She has worked with a number of local and international NGOs and international and non-governmental NGOs. She has been a lecturer at Kenyatta University and the University of Nairobi in gender and development studies in Kenya. She has been working with American Friends Service Committee as the Quaker International Affairs representative for Africa for the last 6 years. Her work entails research for advocacy with national bodies, sub and regional bodies in Africa, such as EAC, IGAD, SADC, which is SADC, and the African Union. She convenes meetings for advocacy using quiet diplomacy to get parties to a conflict and to address peace. She has a lot of experience in network building, research advocacy, in terms of policy, gender, and development. Now, it is truly our privilege, Dr. Kamau. Maybe you will open up the conversation, and then I will introduce Melanie as we get to her. Welcome, Dr. Kamau. Go ahead. I think you're muted. Check. I think,
Mute. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
For the good introduction. Let me first of all, my internet, if you allow me to switch off the camera for now, okay. Then I'll put it on later.
Sure.
Yes, as you heard, my name is Pauline Kamau. I'll be talking about the reversing financial theft and reshaping mechanisms to restore well-being and the role of faith-based community. I want to first start by giving you some verses from the Bible, because these are the guiding verses that I want us to start with. And the first one is Ephesians 5:11, which tells us to take no part in the unfruitful work of darkness, but instead expose them. I also looked at John 1, verse 3, John 1, 3, 17 to 18, and Proverbs 28, verses 27, 1 Timothy 5, verses 8, which says stewardship isn't about giving back to God. It is about using what he has given to us to accomplish the work that he has given us. So that is what we should be doing, to take care of God's work, the stewardship. So from a brief background, let me say that Africa is not poor. If I look at the estimated untapped minerals in the region, for example, Democratic Republic of Congo, if I look at it, it has got about, or it produces about $24 trillion worth of minerals every year, yet that is a country which is in poverty. And in 2015, the African countries alone exported $232 billion worth of minerals to the rest, and oil to the rest of Africa. But about a third, two-thirds of the continent live in less than $3 a day. And of course, Africa alone is the home of 30% of the world mineral reserve. Not forgetting that even 10% of the world's oil. So what is happening? 8% of natural gas, we have it. And I want to remember what Kebaruka of the Africa Development Bank said in 2015. He said that Africa loses 62.2 billion in illegal outflows and price manipulation every year, much of it exported by multinational, not multinational companies. Those are the ones I'm addressing myself to. I wanted to address myself to other financial institutions like World Bank and IMF, but I said, no, let me first of all concentrate on the multinational companies. I also remember in the late Kofi Annan also highlighted the DRC. And he said in 2012 that DRC lost $1.36 billion in potential revenues. And this one was due to knockdown of sales of mining assets by offshore companies, not offshore company. So why is this? When multinational companies export commodities and such minerals from Africa, the African countries benefit marginally. That is about DRC. If I go to Ghana, which was the former Gold Coast, and the name Gold Coast is because of the gold that is in that country. And actually, less than 1.7% of the global returns from the gold in Ghana is the only one which goes to Ghanaian government. But 98.3% is managed by outside entities. So only 1.7% comes back to Ghana. And the dominant narrative that has been there by IMF and others is that is bad governance and corruption. I don't want to deny that there is no corruption, but if multinational companies keep 98.3%, and then 1.7% is the one that goes back to Ghana, tell me, how can a country ever come out of poverty? Is that bad corruption? Is that bad governance and corruption? And of course, I know foreign companies have also perpetuated the conflict in DRC. There are so many reports that can show us. And of course, because some of those minerals are used to finance armed gangs. And of course, the other thing I also want to point out is that in spite of all this, Democratic Republic of Congo has investment agreements, but they also undermine the environmental rights. And this one has resulted in displacement, environment issues, and those are the many other challenges. So I also want to point out very quickly to Ghana, because I know, to Nigeria, because I don't have time. And I want also to mention about Shell. And it is responsible for 6.4 million liters of oil spilled into the region of Nile Delta in the last 30 years. And you see what is happening there, issues of climate change and all that. And of course, I want also now to say that the host countries have weaker bargaining position. And of course, if we say they blacklist the multinational companies for environmental violations, this becomes a challenge. So most of the time, the host countries choose to ignore that the financial institutions are doing damage to their country, because they say that, what can we do? So let me now go to see what can the the role of faith communities, so that I don't dwell much on the background. And of course, throughout history, faith community is the most trusted than even governments, from experience. And when they join forces, they can even tell the state, this is what we want. Their voices against injustice, corruption, they are heard. And without questions, people overwhelmingly, especially in Africa, they are religious. And of course, I would want to urge the faith and religious community is that they have billions of people. So this voice is so powerful, is the cornerstone of what can help Africa regain from what is happening. And of course, the other thing is that the faith leaders, they lead their flock. If they tell them this is the right direction, and I want to mention right direction as stipulated by the Bible, not on the wrong direction. And of course, while I'm not saying that they become firebrand, I want to say that faith communities can use open government information, to address whatever is happening. They can also arrange campaigns, and of course, sometimes boycott, sanctions, even divestment. And of course, they can use that muscle which they have in the country, where they are, they shouldn't even be part of that corruption, where they are able to tell the policymaker, this is what we want to do. We have faith-based communities outside Africa. What are they doing to what is happening in Africa? Are we talking to those multinational companies to tell them, this is what is happening? You are mining in Congo, this is what's happening there. And you are mining in Ghana, you only give 1.7%. We want 98.3%, and you take 1.7%. That is the way we want it reversed. So we want the faith community to join hands, campaign, and documenting evidence of what is happening. Let them build movements, working with experts, engaging stakeholders, media, and others. Let them build capacity of the masses, and they will follow them. And we need to pick out pressure points of influencers. Who are those people who are influencing? And we have got so many of them in this continent. So can we use them? And we use the good word to ensure that financial institutions are not taking out what belongs to Africa. We want to protect what God has given us for the next generation. And of course, we want them to involve all members, and we want for them to advocate for divestment from harmful and problematic projects. As a last resort, because that is what now we are asking. And of course, we want to demand from the multinational companies, they use their huge profits to invest in climate adaptation and climate justice. We also want them to use the money they make in support of health, education, technology, and of course, they contribute, since they contribute to abuse of human rights, can they reverse those changes? So religious communities, let us form network all over the world. Let us have a narrative of people are suffering, and now we want to invoke action. It is a call for action for for the leaders. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Kamal. I think you got off to a very good start, and thank you for using 10 minutes, no more than 10 minutes of your time. We really do appreciate that, and that's a very good way to start, and a really firebrand way. If you are just joining us, my name is Stephen Rogers. I'm the moderator for this workshop. The title for the program is Reversing Financial Theft and Reshaping Mechanisms to Restore Well-being, the Role of Faith-Based Communities. We have just listened to Dr. Pauline Kamau from Kenya, and now we are going to listen to our next speaker, who will also add her own very remarkable experience and voice to this conversation. And if you want to just participate, and maybe you don't want to ask a question at some point, you are on your right, you can find a Q&A where you can just chat, send your message, and we will read those, as well as if you want, you can just send a chat. Now, I am going to turn on to our next speaker, who is Melanie Foley. Ms. Foley is a Deputy Director for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. She leads the outreach and the coalition building strategies to bolster Global Trade Watch's campaigns on international trade negotiations, such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, which is the IPEF, and the global movement to roll back damaging international economic structures, such as Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. For more than a decade, she has supported GTW's mission to advance U.S. trade policy that puts workers, consumers, and the environment before corporate profits. She is also the U.S. co-chair of the Trade Policy Committee of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, TACD. It is our privilege, and I'm so honored to have you here. And welcome, Ms. Foley, and you can pick it up from there. Thank you.
Thank you. The honor is mine. Thanks to the hosts and to Dr. Kamau for that great introduction. And I think you'll see that the multinational corporations will be a through line throughout this whole conversation. So I'm here to talk about trade policy, and trade and development can lift people out of poverty when done right. However, we have witnessed for far too often how trade agreements have failed to distribute these gains fairly, exacerbating economic inequality, and increasing forced migration and hunger. Previous trade agreements put good-paying jobs, nutritious food, and the right to live in a safe, healthy environment out of reach for people on the margins, both in the United States and in developing countries especially. So I'm going to share some information on trade negotiations happening between the US and Kenya right now, and how we can make our voices heard. And there are perhaps some opportunities for positive change through those talks, and also a lot of perils that we need to be closely watching. But first, I'd like to start with some context. So my organization, Public Citizen, has been monitoring the impacts of US trade policy on workers, consumers, and the environment for decades. And unfortunately, it has not been a positive story for the majority of us in the US and around the world. So how does this happen? Instead of creating our trade policy in a transparent, democratic forum, like our legislative process or even other international negotiations, like in the UN system, our trade negotiations have taken place in utter secrecy, with a trade advisory system made up of around 500 corporate advisors that have access to the texts. The public hasn't known what is in these agreements until they are finished and signed, and it's too late to make real changes. The result has been that the benefits go to big corporations and make it easier for them to take advantage of low wages and lack of worker and environmental protections, and facilitating a global race to the bottom. And this happened not just because tariffs or the taxes placed on imported goods were lowered, but because the rules were rigged to benefit multinational corporations at the expense of the rest of us. For example, there were rules inserted into past trade agreements that limited governments' ability to pass certain types of laws to protect food safety. And pharmaceutical companies have won terms that allowed them to expand their monopolies and block generic competition for life-saving medicines. And companies have won sweeping corporate rights for foreign investors, allowing corporations to even sue governments in unaccountable tribunals outside their national courts to win unlimited amounts of taxpayer money over laws that they claim violate their rights as investors, including environmental or public health laws. Now, none of these rules were really about trade, but about expanding corporate power. And Republicans and Democrats in the White House alike have pushed this model of corporate-dominated trade since the early 1990s. So, unsurprisingly, there has been a massive opposition, both here in the US and in other countries, to this model. Due to cross-border solidarity, we managed to stop some of the biggest attempts to expand this model. We stopped a major expansion of the World Trade Organization, the so-called Doha Round. We stopped a major project to expand the model to all of the Americas, the free trade area of the Americas in the early 2000s. And more recently, we stopped the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, a deal that could not receive majority support in Congress because of these extreme corporate rules. So with that pushback, our politicians have had to respond to this shifting political landscape. As the manufacturing base in the US was hollowed out due to bad trade policies, even the right wing capitalized on the anger against these trade agreements. But they scapegoated the workers in other countries instead of focusing on the real culprits, the corporations that were rigging the rules to abuse workers here and exploit them in other countries. So with all of that context, that brings us to the US-Kenya trade negotiations. When he was president, Trump launched negotiations with Kenya for a free trade agreement, FTA. When Biden took office, those FTA negotiations were halted to review their compatibility with the Build Back Better agenda. And I guess they determined those talks weren't very compatible because they never resumed those talks. But Biden instead launched a US-Kenya Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership, STIP or STIP. And I apologize for all the acronyms. I think it is by design to make trade policy seem boring and innocuous when it's anything but. So the shift from the FTA to this STIP is a reflection of President Biden's response to the shifting political landscape around trade. While he previously supported past FTAs, he is now calling for worker-centric trade and insisting that his new trade initiatives, including the one with Kenya, will not look like a traditional FTA. The first round of negotiations for the STIP just took place in Nairobi last week. From what we know so far, our movement has secured some important wins in that the Biden administration is not planning to include the extreme investor rights that allow corporations to sue governments, and it's not going to include the intellectual property rights that have been pushed by pharma corporations. They also claim that labor and environmental rules will be central in these negotiations. But the devil will always be in the details, and so far, we're still not allowed to see what's being negotiated. There is unfortunately still a very unbalanced trade advisory system with hundreds of corporate advisors and just a handful of labor groups that have access to the text, while it's classified for the rest of us. We've been demanding a different, more open process to produce a different, better outcome, one that benefits people here in Kenya and throughout the region. So with all this secrecy, one way to get an idea of what might be coming in this agreement is to look at the demands that US big businesses are making. We know from reviewing formal comment submissions that big tech companies see this Kenya STIP as an opportunity to insert binding rules over so-called digital trade, rules that would thwart both governments' efforts to regulate these businesses and hold them accountable. For more on this, I encourage folks to read the works of Dr. Melissa Omino at Strathmore University in Nairobi. She's analyzed and documented this corporate wish list. The digital trade proposals that big tech is pushing for the Kenya STIP are not focused on remedying actual problems related to the sale of online goods. They're not dealing with tariff evasion and product safety. Instead, they're doing what we saw Big Pharma do with intellectual property. which is to promote binding rules to limit governments worldwide from regulating them in the interests of workers, consumers, or smaller business competitors. So specifically, tech companies want binding rules to limit the ability of governments to regulate where firms send and store our personal data. They want rules to shield online platforms from accountability for harmful content on their sites. They want special rules to protect monopolies and harm competition by banning certain policies. And they want to undermine the investigation of discriminatory source code and algorithms through prohibitions on technology transfer requirements and trade secret protections. Now, that's a lot of jargon, but this last one is a major issue right now. We've seen with this recent explosion of artificial intelligence raises a lot of questions for regulators. And we've seen too many examples of the algorithms and source code behind this type of technology replicating and amplifying existing racial, gender, and other biases. Big tech wants binding rules to limit government's ability to require pre-screening of algorithms and source code, which is a tool that could help prevent discrimination in AI-based hiring practices, predictive policing programs, and other critical applications. So the creation of these digital trade rules appears to be the primary driver behind this whole patchwork of agreements that we've seen the administration pursue, of which the Kenya STIP is just one. And in fact, a recent report just detailed how the whole concept of digital trade was fabricated by industry lobbyists to conceal what they're really about, which is getting them more power. Now, we know that there are some people in the administration, such as US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, who are trying to move away from the traditional model and fix some of the problems with our past trade pacts. But others in the administration just want any deal they can get to claim to be countering China's influence in the region. And we know that the corporate interests continue to have privileged access. So we can't let these negotiations fly under the radar, as that is a recipe for the corporate interests to dominate. Which brings me to how you can help. So as I mentioned before, People Power United Across Borders has succeeded before through research-backed advocacy, direct engagement with decision makers, and mobilizing to show our strength. We've gotten bad provisions out of trade agreements and sunk agreements too terrible to save. So the first thing you can do is to stay informed. In addition to following news on the Kenya STIP, I encourage folks to keep an eye on US trade negotiations in the Indo-Pacific. That's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, a 14-nation agreement being negotiated that is much further along than the STIP is. And whatever we see agreed to with the IPEF is likely to be proposed in the STIP as well. The next thing is that this agreement is not going to be going through Congress, which presents its own process issues. But nonetheless, for folks in the US, your representative and senators are still key actors who can influence the administration's position in negotiations. So tell your elected officials to be a champion for a new model of trade, one that is transparent and puts working people in all negotiating countries before big business demands. And finally, if you or your organization would like to be involved in the civil society coalition working on the STIP, please reach out to me. And if I can, I'll put my email in the chat. I also have some resources on the various topics I've discussed that I'd be happy to share.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you for a very, very detailed, good analysis of the trade agreement and the asymmetries in international trade. And I think I wouldn't have really learned so much from even taking a whole semester class as you have well done put it. And I thank you, Citizens, your organization, for following up on this. I think what you have demonstrated is really the connectedness between some of these trade agreements that happen in global cities, such as here in Washington, D.C., and its impact on small economies, smaller countries. Kenya, Nairobi, whether it's in Lagos, or whether it's in Freetown, Sierra Leone. So all of these have clear connections. And I think you put this so well, especially with the example that you gave about STEEP, which was the first time I attended your organization's meeting, and I was able to learn that this trade was going on and there was so much secrecy around it. So now we have 14 minutes. What I wanted to just do is briefly just summarize some of the, just without going too deep into what the speakers have said. I think they were very much clear. Dr. Kamal, I think I really appreciate the way you were able to draw the distinction, especially looking at multinational corporations, not looking at the IMF or looking at the World Bank and these global institutions that we so often, we focus on. Now, they are absolutely part of the global architecture, but I think what you were saying was there are multinational corporations as well that often don't get to the top of the radar, and they benefit from some of the trade agreements that Melanie so well articulated. And we, for instance, at Africa Faith and Justice Network, we work on land grabbing, and some of these things go, multinational corporations go out there and they make a lot of these agreements with local companies or local organizations, and without necessarily negotiating with the people. I wanted to go, if you're just joining us, our workshop here is titled Reversing Financial Theft and Reshaping Mechanisms to Restore Well-being, the Role of Faith-Based Organizations. One of the questions that just came up, and I wanted to throw this out to both of you, is, I think it's from one of our members, is the US side still demanding that Kenya and their plastic use ban as one of the trade negotiations? Melanie, I think you spoke a little bit about that. Do you want to just address that one?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you for raising that. This is something that we saw during the Trump era, during his US-Kenya FTA negotiations, that the US plastics industry was lobbying the US government, trying to convince the US government to pressure Kenya to roll back or weaken or get rid of their stronger, plastic bag bans and other, plastics policies. Because we never saw the text of that agreement, we don't know if that demand actually made it into the US, texts or proposals. But it was definitely something that the industry was pushing for. It's not something that we've seen come up in this round of talks yet, but definitely something we want to keep an eye out for.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melanie. Dr. Kamal, I wanted to just touch a little bit on, you talked a little bit about extractive industries, and you said they have a role to play. One of the themes of this conversation is really reversing roles here. So using the same weapons that have been used as weapons of war, and in this sense, weapons of financial theft and weapons of financial war, into plowshares. In other words, using those same weapons to reverse the poverty architecture that has been created over the years. Now, how do the faith-based organizations, who, as you said, we are so well placed, we have a lot of credibility, we have a vast number of membership. In other words, majority of people in developing countries are faith-based, whether it's Islam, Christian, Catholic, but also there's a lot of credibility among them. How do they work together as a team, especially since these are really not necessarily the best, and how do they formulate a kind of alliance that would allow, for instance, multinational corporations who are focused on the bottom line to see that there's profit in peace, or there's profit in value-based business, as opposed to the kind of predatory practices that we have seen, especially when it comes to extractive industries in Africa, specifically in this case like DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's quite something, but I want to attempt to answer it and say that how can the faith-based community come together? That is something which grapples most of the faith-based communities, but I would want to ask them, can you learn from the developing countries? And why am I saying that? In Africa, we have what we call interreligious council. And this is different denominations. They come together. When it is about peace, they are talking about peace building. They are talking about, like now the Sudan, they join all together. Why not when it comes to extractive minerals when it is being done? Is there a way they can come together? The first thing I would want us to do, let us start with what we have. Let us start with the networks we have. How can we bring these networks together? And if we start by doing that, we get to know who is the key influencer if it is Catholic, who is the key influencer? If it is Muslim, who is the key influencer? We get these people together, do our mapping amongst ourselves, and we see who has got, what it takes. It's almost like a system which you are going to look at the loops and who talks to who and all that. It is some work that we are going to do. And without that, we will keep on saying that let's do something. But let us start from the examples we have in Africa. Let us start talking to Interreligious Council, and we see how do they do their thing. The Kenya religious organization, they also come together. So how do they do it? And they forget I'm Muslim, I'm what we are focusing on is the theft in these countries. What we are focusing on is the violence in DRC. They should use that angle, and then we start talking together and we start, moving, the ideas that the multinational companies, they need to be talked to. They'll be told, we are watching you. And once that is done, shaming them, and a whole world, shaming, multinational companies, there will bound to be a change. So let us start with what we know. Let us start from the basics. Who is where? Which denominations have come together? Can we start learning from that? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamal. Thank you. And if you're joining us, the title for this workshop is Reversing Financial Theft and Reshaping Mechanisms to Restore Well-being, the Role of Faith-Based Organizations. Melanie, there's a question for you on the Q&A, and this is coming from Bonnie. By the way, she says, a very excellent presentation from both of you. But the question she had is the scenario that you have laid with reference to the steep. And she said it's quite scary. She says, and I mean, in the sense that being very realistic. She wanted to know, can you give us a timeline for the Kenyan trade agreement in terms of what is happening and what needs to be done specifically?
Yeah, thank you. So for the timeline, we've heard that it could happen in as little as about a year, that it could be finalized. And we've, again, looking at the IPEF as kind of an example of what we can expect with this STIP. The Indo-Pacific Agreement, they've said that they want to finish that by this November. And that is a much bigger endeavor. It's been going on for longer, so about 2 years. But it's with 14 countries. And so for them to move so quickly through that is absolutely breakneck speed. It's unprecedented. We'll see if they end up making it or not. In trade world, there are often grand promises of deadlines that get missed. But so we'll see what happens there. And then that could be an indication that things will move very quickly with the Kenya STIP. So unfortunately, now is the best time to take action on this. And especially before the US has actually tabled or proposed its text. So, once the US submits their text to the other country, it's very hard to get changes to it. The other countries may not want to spend the political power to convince the US to change what it has submitted. So, right now, while the US is still coming up with what their provisions are going to be, is the best time to take action.
Okay, thank you. And can you, because you and Dr. Kamal, I think one of the things you seem to have noted in terms of action for faith-based organizations is that we have a lot of leverage now, not just on the continent where some of these we see the negative impact of these financial architectural asymmetries, but also in the powerful cities in the world like Washington, D.C. Now, I know you try to engage a lot of organizations in the advocacy. Can you share as much as you can, especially with faith-based organizations who could probably use that information and see how they can hold their representatives or their government responsible in terms of really making sure that, I think what your focus is on transparency here, so that people know and people get engaged as well. And if you can do that, I think that would be very, very helpful. I'm sure you have, but I'm pretty sure for some people here listening, this might be like the first time they're hearing that, which speaks to the very relevance of your work in the sense that many of these trade agreements are really started in and mostly done in secrecy. I have a question for you, Dr. Kamau, and this is actually coming from the audience. It says, where is the statistics that I think you cited the statistics, the 1.7% of wealth remaining in the country? Can you provide a link and probably some type of explanation? I think what they're asking was, I remember, I think you were talking about when these multinational corporations, I think when they go and sign these extractive industries, at the end of the day, this is only how much stays in the country, and 90 something percent or 80 something percent goes out of the country. I hope I am correct. That's what I think Bonnie is asking. Can you maybe a minute or two just talk about that, Dr. Bonnie?
Yeah, I think I'll post it. I was trying to cut and paste, but apparently it's not happening. But I will provide that link. But it is very easy to get it. You can
Okay, thank you.
And for what statistics of what has been happening in Africa. And
are you okay? I'm sorry. Are you done or is it? Okay. Did we lose you, Dr. Kamal? Okay. All right. So let me ask this question for both of you. I don't know if we missed you, and maybe you can come back in and just. This one is really a much broad question. I know we have 4 minutes remaining, and you've been very awesome, both of you, in terms of managing time. The question is, how can faith leaders on the continent be effective when they are not well trained in social justice? Their message still is based on blessed are the poor message, keeping them in all the day prayers meetings instead of taking them in public square. Now, in other words, they're not necessarily prepared for this level of engagement in advocacy because it requires some amount of skill. What are some of your recommendations? Melanie, I think we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's my place to say how that should happen, but I'll just note that we've had great engagement from faith-based groups, both within the U.S. and across the African continent, on trade issues. So I think that is an area where we've seen some political power flexed, and to the blessed are the poor. Blessed also are those who fight for what's right. So I think that it's within all of your communities to keep fighting the good fight, and I look forward to any other suggestions on how to keep that social justice message going.
Okay, no problem. That's a fair response from you, Melanie. Dr. Kamal, are you back with us? Okay, so Dr. Kamal is.
I think I was. It's probably the internet that was fluctuating. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Did you want to respond to that, since you are from the Quakers, and the question was faith-based leaders on the continent, how can they be more effective when they are not trained in social justice? How do they get into this level of advocacy from a Quaker perspective? Is there any recommendation that you have?
Yes, I think. Sorry, can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Yes. Yeah, I may also not be the one to answering on behalf of Quakers, but I know they can. And what platforms can they use? They normally have a meeting, which they have a congregation where they meet all of them, throughout the world. The Quaker yearly meeting. Those are some of the platforms they can use. If I look at all other denominations like Africa Conference of Churches, there is a time they meet. So why don't we push that as part of the agenda? This is what we want you to start talking about. And they can adapt that agenda. And there are so many of those kind of faith-based organizations, if it is the Muslims and all that, Interreligious Council, take that to them, and they are willing to learn. Most of them say it's because we do not know. Can you educate us? And that is something that needs to be done. Build their capacity. Let them know about the issues. Give them the figures so that they are able to advocate better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think with that, you pretty much summarize it so well. And on behalf of the ADNA, which organized this, and all of our colleagues who put this together, we want to first of all thank you, the two speakers, who did your very good research and are able to provide a real perspective to it. And we are grateful that you were willing to come here and make a very good presentation. And we are hoping that somehow you can share some of these resources with us, because faith-based leaders are really eager to be more engaged than they have in the past. And we feel like we have to keep working, otherwise, and we will not be able to reverse the financial theft that we see that African countries have already experienced. I want to thank you, and I want to thank our audience and for putting this together and for coming and listening. And on behalf of Africa Faith and Justice Network, where I work, I want to thank you so much. And you have a wonderful day and have a wonderful night. Bye-bye now. Thank you.
Thank you.